the first three moved freely throughout the continent, into the south, and into the west, and into the eastern and northern parts of the continent. But eventually, the last three were able to migrate out of Africa across this stretch where Egypt and Palestine link into the Eurasian domain. And of course, the African was able to march across his beautiful continent and then cross this small body of water at the Straits of Gibraltar and travel into Europe. So by various means, the African was able to people Asia and the so-called Middle East and the European continent. So the last three hominids, or early humanity, was able to march out of Africa. And so we still maintain the monogenetic African thesis. But the interesting thing was, and that's millions of years ago. So if you're talking about an African timeline, you have to talk about that timeline going back millions of years. But the interesting thing is that the European was able to postulate that although early humanity has its roots in Africa, because the scientific fossil remains have established that, he was able to postulate, hypothesize, come up with various theses and theories that modern man had its origin, however, in Europe. And somehow, though, there were several branches of humankind, one an old branch in Africa, but a more modern branch emerged in Europe. That's the polygenetic thesis. In other words, several roots of genesis of the human family. And that thesis allowed for the Europeans to postulate that this later man that they originated out of was that man which developed a large brain, and was that man which became modern man. And so he was able to stamp on the human family the concept of the Cro-Magnon. Cro-Magnon man, the large-brained modern man, and it is from this modern man, Homo sapiens sapien, that modern humankind developed, particularly the European branch that's supposedly superior. But unfortunately, as there is this enormous explosion of information, and that's why we have to form our study group so we can tap into it and keep our eyes open vigilantly and study and restudy and reread even previous works. Fortunately, this explosion of information has established that various scientific finds, molecular biology and other modern means of scientific research has established that Cro-Magnon man, or Homo sapiens sapien, also has his and her origin in Africa. In fact, this article in Newsweek doesn't deal with the old humanity, which goes back millions of years in Africa. This particular article is important and crucial because it deals with modern man, Homo sapiens sapien. And it points out that modern man has his origin also in Africa. The research was conducted on more than 100 or so of the women from around the world, from the different groups, and their placentas, etc., were tested. And with DNA and RNA research, they were able to take the human tree and unveil it and take it back through time to an African woman in Africa, East Africa, the birthplace of humankind, 200,000 plus years ago. So now the earliest finds of Cro-Magnon men, or Homo sapiens sapien, have been found in Africa. So scientific information has fairly put to rest this whole question of the African origin of humankind. We come from one human tree, and that's the African tree. In fact, Dr. Diop, in his book, The African Triumph that he completed with Civilization and Barbarism, Dr. Diop talks about Glover's law, which relates to mammals in the sun developing melanin to resist the ultraviolet rays of the sun. And the human family is a part of the mammal family. And so clearly, if humankind existed for any length of time back into antiquity, for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, even millions of years, that existence was in the sun, and that existence had to have been around a black skin or melanized epidermal skin pigment. So clearly, the scientific data is establishing the African origin. But we have a problem, because not only do we have the myths and misconceptions about a European origin and the falsification of history around those things, but we also have our Judeo-Christian heritage, which, although it is not scientific and not historic, has left an enormous mark on thinking of the world, that somehow or other a Garden of Eden is the story of humankind. But we say, even within the religious and spiritual traditions, if there was a Garden of Eden, that Garden of Eden was not by the nature of ecological development in Europe, in the ice. It had to be in the sun, and that most likely would have been in Africa. So even if we talk about the religious traditions of the origin of humankind, we've got to go back into the African continent. And even if we talk about the Judeo-Christian religious traditions of humankind and Islamic traditions of humankind, we have to go back to Africa, because Africa is the birthplace of those great religious systems. And so that Europe certainly was not the first Christian nation, or where Judaism had its birthplace. Clearly, the traditions of the churches themselves and the religious systems themselves point them to the African continent as the foundation for their culture and development. So whether we're talking about the biblical tradition of origin, we have an African origin,